I, Randhir Kumar Gautam, on behalf of Gandhian School of Democracy and Socialism, welcome you to attend today's GSDS Forum Weekly Dialogue. And first of all, I welcome the respected chair of today's session, Professor Anand Kumar, our mentor. I welcome a speaker of today's session, Winton, very deep seeker and an economist from Australia. I welcome Jayant Tomar ji, Dr. Alok Bajpai, Minti Pradhan ji, Veronica ji, and all friends present here. You know, the topic of today's GSDS weekly forum dialogue is freedom, progress, and human flourishing, which is a book by Winton, an Australian economist. So before introducing him, let me introduce our GSDS weekly forum. A GSDS weekly forum is a platform to promote understanding the dynamics of society with quest for freedom, justice, equality, and fraternity. It focuses on knowledge and dialogue among concerned persons. We organize a dialogue on every Friday, and we invite people from different fields of life, having very different perspective to understand the world and society. So this time we have with us Australian economist Winton Waits. He first became professionally involved in a broad issue concerning human flourishing in the early 1990s. Before then, his career focused on public policy relating to economic development, international trade, productivity growth, and technological progress. So he has a kind of multi-diverse orientation to understand society and economist. Retaining his professional interest in such matters, he has become increasingly interested in economic history, happiness, welfare economics, self-help psychology, politics, and Australian philosophy. This book on which we are going to discuss in terms of today's GSDS weekly forum dialogue is a book draw upon Waits' knowledge in those fields, particularly the idea of freedom, which is a necessary condition for economic growth. And Professor George Manson, Professor Michel R. Romero, who is from George Mason University, wrote a very excellent overview of a review of this book. And the very interesting thing is in his articulation is that how freedom, progress, and human flourishing are a kind of closely related concepts and are perhaps among the most important for understanding what enables us all to live a meaningful life. So this book is a kind of interaction with psychological insight, philosophical insight, economics insight, and these three insights makes the mechanism of governance or mechanism of democracy that all of us quest for. So for giving a kind of brief introduction of the topic, I would like to invite chair of today's session, Professor Anand Kumar, to share his thought, and then we'll invite a respected speaker. Yes, Professor Anand Kumar, over to you.
Thank you, Randhir ji, and I thank Professor Waits to give his time for introducing us to the discourse about this interesting triangle of freedom, progress and human flourishing. Gandhian School for Democracy and Socialism is very happy to have this dialogue by the Indian morning hours and afternoon in Australia by one of the most concerned economic thinkers of our time. It is something which is related with the Gandhian quest, where the question of freedom and progress and their interrelation was deeply interrogated. In the European mind, the idea of progress was an essential precondition for creating a freedom-based society. In the colonial world, particularly in India or South Africa, the idea of freedom was considered as a precondition for progress. There cannot be any progress without freedom. Whereas the European journey of human family, freedom was found to be a consequence of progress from feudal stage to liberal capitalist development or democratic development. Gandhiji was always concerned about human potential of self-realization, of creating betterment, cultivating goodness, and that's where freedom and progress were intertwined. He thought freedom begins with us individually by making us capable of making choices and making a journey from violence to non-violence, from greed to selflessness, from selfishness to serving the society, altruism. So today, it looks like a very promising discussion, because what is the relationship between freedom and progress is one part of the theme, and how freedom and progress are going to contribute to human flourishing, because it seems that today human society has ended before us in terms of our human imagination. Where are we headed? During the Second World War, we thought that we are facing a disaster in our capacity to destroy ourselves through nuclear bombs. Today, bombs or no bombs, they are destroying our ecology. And it is all in the name of freedom and in quest of progress. So, not becoming a barrier between you and the speaker of the day, may I invite our special guest to make his contribution for next 30 to 45 minutes as he pleases. It will be followed by our session of question answer. Professor Bates, please.
Thank you very much for your invitation to me to speak today, and thank you for those introductions. Soon after my book, Freedom, Progress and Human Flourishing, was published, one of my friends asked me whether I thought the ideas in the book would be of any interest to people who do not trace their cultural heritage to the philosophers of ancient Greece. That was a good question to ask. My response was that the book was about universal values, so I hoped the ideas would be of interest to everyone. I might be about to find out a little bit more about that today in the feedback I get. Nevertheless, the book was written mainly for readers who live in the Western liberal democracies. One of the messages in the book is that people who live in those societies should count their blessings, because they have many blessings to count. I think that too many people who live in the Western liberal democracies have come to take their liberty and prosperity for granted, placing their opportunities to flourish at risk because they're becoming too dependent on governments. The concept of human flourishing is central to the book. I approach human flourishing from the perspective of an individual who is reflecting on what it means to be a flourishing human. I have tried to distance myself from the top-down perspective of social planners who are seeking to pursue goals set by governments or international agencies. What does it mean to be a flourishing human? As I say in the book, that is a question that individuals can make their own judgments about. It is a matter for discussion and reflection. I draw on the ancient wisdom of Aristotle and some modern writers to seek to persuade readers that there are 5 basic goods that a flourishing human could be expected to have. And those are wise and well-informed self-direction, health and longevity, positive relationships with others, 4th, living in harmony with nature, and psychological well-being. Now, I explain why I've chosen those in the book, but there are only a couple of points I want to make about that list now. First is that those basic goods are linked together in an integrated whole when an individual is flourishing. When you ask someone, how are you faring these days? They're likely to talk about a combination of different things related to the basic goods. They'll talk about their health and their friendships and you know, whether they're feeling on top of the world or down in the dumps, and so forth. My second point, though, is that although humans share some basic needs with other animals, lots of basic needs with other animals, the capacity for individual self-direction is particularly important to humans. Wise and well-informed self-direction helps us to stay healthy in mind and body, to have positive relationships with others, and to live in harmony with nature. It's about being wise. So the importance of wise and well-informed self-direction is a theme of the book. Part 1 of the book, Freedom, discusses the importance of liberty to self-direction and how liberty has evolved. There was a time when I used to puzzle over the question of how much liberty should be sacrificed to promote human flourishing. However, about 15 years ago, after reading a book, Norms of Liberty, I'm not sure if you can see that, by Douglas Rasmussen and Douglas Denell, I realized that it makes no sense to think in terms of a need to choose whether priority should be given to liberty or to human flourishing. Human flourishing does not exist apart from the flourishing of individuals, and the flourishing of individuals is not possible without opportunities for self-direction. So once we recognize the importance of self-direction to individual flourishing, that poses the question of what are the rules of the game or legal order would allow these opportunities for individual self-direction? Well, the obvious answer to that question is an order which protects liberty. The protection of individual liberty, the protection of individual liberty or the natural rights of individuals provides the context in which individuals can flourish in different ways, provided they do not interfere with the rights of others. So, yeah, I think there in terms of freedom of religion. Some people have problems with the idea that people have natural rights to life, liberty, and property. They may acknowledge the existence of the rights that are recognized in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but they see such rights as having been created by the actions of governments. Now, I argue that as a result of social evolution, most humans, most of us have intuitions that tell us that violations of natural rights are unjust, even when national governments or United Nations or whatever do not recognize the injustice of those things. These intuitions and norms of just conduct may have evolved as our ancestors recognized the benefits of cooperative behavior for mutual benefit. You cannot obtain the benefits of trade unless you refrain from murdering, enslaving, or stealing from potential trading partners. Go back to the ancient, the poems of Hesiod, who was one of the founders of Greek epic poetry. He illustrates that the respect for the rights of others was an ancient ideal. Hesiod advocated that people should seek prosperity through market competition rather than through violent predatory activity. Of course, most residents of Athens were non-citizens or slaves. But the Athenian democracy gave those fortunate enough to have citizenship considerable individual liberty, as well as the right to participate in politics. Similarly, the laws of ancient Rome gave citizens immunity from arbitrary arrest and recognized their rights to make legal contracts, to own property, to choose an occupation, and to move freely, as well as the right to vote and stand for public office. So you had in the ancient world some recognition of these rights. So how did those ideas about laws of just conduct protecting natural rights travel to the modern West? Well, there was some continuity in laws protecting natural rights following the decline of the Western Roman Empire. So as in ancient Athens and Rome, law was largely a product of the work of jurists discovering precedents. I'm talking here about Western Europe, of course. There was less continuity in philosophical reasoning about liberty and natural rights. But important contributions were made by church scholars following the recovery of the writings of Aristotle in the 13th century. The Spanish scholastics made major contributions to the understanding of natural rights before John Locke made his famous contribution in the 17th century. John Locke built on those ideas. Now, his contribution was nevertheless extremely important in promoting widespread recognition of natural rights in Europe and in the American colonies. Similarly, in the 18th century, Adam Smith made an important contribution, advocating what he referred to as the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. That's very brief, but I don't have time to go into much detail. In considering the discussion of part one of my book, in concluding that discussion, I emphasize that the development of ideas about liberty and natural rights in Europe has not been an orderly process. It was not inevitable that our natural rights would be recognized as much as they are today. And there are no grounds for complacency that they will continue to be recognized in future. So in part two of the book on progress, I discuss how liberty provided the context in which individuals have been able to flourish in the Western liberal democracies. The central idea of progress that I adopt in the book is the growth of opportunities to obtain the basic goods of a flourishing human. As I've discussed already, self-direction is integral to the flourishing of each individual. That implies that progress occurs when individuals are able to meet their aspirations to a greater extent. since most people aspire to improve the quality of their life, my view of progress is broadly consistent with the view of progress. This is a historical view of progress as ongoing betterment of the conditions of humanity. So, as I see it, economic growth counts as progress only to the extent that people aspire to have the goods that it offers. It was not until the 17th century that opinion leaders in Europe began to see the potential for advances in science to enable improvement of living conditions. The book discusses contributions of various intellectuals in Europe, particularly in France and Scotland, which fostered the idea that ongoing betterment of the conditions of humanity might be possible. My analysis suggests that there are many common elements in the determinants of opportunities to have the basic goods. Liberty, a culture of trust, and high incomes are particularly important in explaining why those opportunities have been greater in some countries than others. I'm talking here about longevity. Things like trust of other people depend friendship depends a lot on trust of other people. These things do tend to be stronger in countries that have more liberty and higher incomes. Over the longer term, the growth of incomes, and we're talking about economic growth, has been closely related to technological progress and productivity growth. Now, over the last 200 years, you've seen this great divergence opening up between average incomes of people in the wealthiest and poorest countries. Fortunately, that's been diminishing over the last few decades. So you see in India and China a much smaller proportion of people in poverty. In order to explain why some countries became wealthy, it's necessary to understand why the industrial revolution occurred when and where it did. You don't need to be reminded that that occurred in Britain in the latter part of began in the latter part of the 18th century. My discussion of the causes of the Industrial Revolution draws heavily on the contributions to economic history of Deirdre McCloskey and Joel Mocha. McCloskey argues that the Industrial Revolution had its origins in ideas and rhetoric, which supported greater liberty and a more positive attitude towards people engaged in commerce. Mocha argues that a scientific revolution and change in attitude towards the natural world, the change in attitude towards the natural world fostered conditions favourable to innovation. I think the most important factor of supporting ongoing innovation has been what McCloskey refers to as the bourgeois deal. On one side of this deal is the willingness of people to accept the possibility that new technology may disrupt their lives. They may have to go and search for new jobs. What they're offered in return is a prospect that they and future generations will benefit from an expansion of opportunities as a result of the introduction of new technology. I wish I could, perhaps people will ask me to explain why I think that's so. Will progress continue? What are the threats to progress that we should be concerned about? I suggest that we should be concerned about real problems. What I mean is that we should be concerned about the known risks, that things that we can do something about. There is no point ruminating about all the possible ways that the world might end, unless you're one of those people who likes ruminating. After considering what surveys of opinion leaders say about the risks that have a significant negative are likely to have a significant negative impact, I've focused in the book on the threats posed by climate change and declining productivity growth. I don't dismiss the longer-term threat posed by climate change, but I argue that there are stronger grounds for concern about the more immediate threat posed by declining productivity growth. Individuals and firms and governments are taking action to mitigate climate change, and their efforts seem likely to accelerate before adaptation becomes excessively costly. So, by contrast, few people in the high-income countries recognise the economic problems that are likely to arise if the rate of productivity growth continues to decline. This matter is considered in the book, along with the question of whether liberal democracies are likely to pursue economic policy reforms to avert major economic crises. I'm not optimistic that governments will deal with the emerging economic problems in time to avert widespread misery. It's all relative, I suppose, but I think we're in for major recessions. However, I am optimistic that when they are in the midst of economic crises, democratic governments will eventually introduce institutional reforms to enable the drivers of progress to restore growth of opportunities. Some of my optimism about that is based on what happened in the 1970s and 80s. I end in part two by suggesting that it is important to keep our valid concerns about the future in perspective. Most people alive today probably have less reason for apprehension about the future than their parents and grandparents had during much of the 20th century, with its 2 world wars and Great Depression. In parts 1 and 2 of the book, I have discussed how freedom and the growth of opportunities shape the context in which individuals seek to have meaningful lives. When we reflect on what determines our own individual flourishing, we observe that our individual capacities for wise and well-informed self-direction are of central importance. In part 3, I discuss the challenges posed by self-direction and personal development. The main point I try to make is that no one can live our lives for us. Self-direction is integral to human flourishing. That seems obvious when we feel a great sense of achievement, when we look back at the good decisions we've made in the past, the good choices that opened up opportunities and enable us to avoid disasters. And of course, when we look back, most of us also see some choices we regret. Self-direction does pose a challenge. My book discusses the relevance of research findings in 2 areas: the determinants of happiness and sources of cognitive errors. Happiness research confirms the ancient wisdom that materialistic aspirations are often associated with low life satisfaction. Nevertheless, wealthy people do tend to have a higher life satisfaction than poor people. I think the moral of that story is that don't have materialistic aspirations unless you are really sure that you can get what you're seeking. Now, to research into cognitive errors, some of the people involved in this research have come to exceedingly pessimistic conclusions. They suggest that we, humans, are so prone to make serious mistakes in pursuing our own happiness that it is virtually impossible for us to meet the challenge of self-direction without help from a wise and well-meaning government. My reading of relevant research findings has left me more optimistic about the capacity of individuals to accept responsibility for managing their own lives, with the help of family and friends, of course, than I am about their capacity as voters to conjure up a wise and well-meaning governments to help them. An awareness of common cognitive errors can help individuals to cope with the challenges of self-direction. For example, it is useful to be aware of the potential for our intuitions to lead us astray in making decisions that require thoughtful deliberation. So how do we know when we need to slow down and think carefully? Well, one way our ancestors were able to do that, they were able to survive because they remembered cautionary tales about the mistakes that others had made by relying on their intuitions when they should have thought more carefully. And of course, that's still possible. We often hear stories about mistakes that people have made by giving insufficient thought to important decisions affecting their careers, finances, and family life. We can learn from mistakes of others. My father used to say that I could learn from his mistakes, but I thought I'd rather make some of my own. Self-control problems are a common form of human fallibility. Jonathan Haidt's rider and elephant metaphor provides a useful way to view this. So the rider and elephant metaphor. The rider represents reason and the elephant represents emotion. The rider can help the elephant to make better choices, but the rider can't order the elephant around against its will. The metaphor illustrates that reason and emotion need to work together to enable intelligent behavior, and that virtue resides in a well-trained elephant. I'll now turn briefly to the role of investment in our own personal development in helping us to flourish. Investment in personal development encompasses many things, including education, on-the-job training, wealth accumulation, healthy living, improving interpersonal skills, knowledge of personal strengths and weaknesses, and working towards the actualization of potential to become a better person. I argue that it makes sense to view the journey through life as a multi-stage process. The investment that we make in each stage of the process has a major impact on the extent to which we are able to flourish at subsequent stages. For example, it obviously makes sense for young people to focus fairly heavily on education that will help them to meet their aspirations. In my view, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs is still central to an understanding of the process of self-actualization. Maslow's theory was developed in the 1940s and has been refined by some of his modern followers. They suggest that there are two main classes of human needs, both deficiency needs and growth needs. The deficiency needs include physiological needs, safety, connection to others, and self-esteem. The growth needs are exploration, love, and purpose. So, unfortunately, people do not necessarily move automatically to satisfy the growth needs when their deficiency needs have been adequately satisfied. To move beyond deficiency needs, individuals require personal values, sometimes referred to as a moral compass, that points them towards growth. Personal growth is a discovery process requiring alertness to new opportunities. The drive for exploration is a core motive for personal growth. As people actualize their potential, they tend to experience an increased incidence of transcending experiences, such as feeling flow when engaged in creative activities, or feeling awe when watching a sunset. So what is it that makes life meaningful? Throughout history, people have had meaningful lives by seeking to acquire the basic goods, just to have the wisdom and information, the scope to make decisions for their own well-being and that of their families, health and longevity, positive relationships with others, very important. Being in harmony with nature is important. People in the West need constant reminder of that, and of course psychological well-being. However, for most people who have ever lived, acquiring the basic goods has been no easy matter. The struggle to survive has played a huge role in making lives meaningful. Survival was an achievement in the face of the threat of famine and the greater threat then posed by disease and war. Over the last 200 years, economic progress has helped increasing numbers to use their capacity for self-direction to prosper. A large part of this individual effort has involved mutually beneficial interaction with family, friends, and economic associates. By those efforts, more people have experienced high life satisfaction, good health, and increased longevity. However, many people have come to view economic progress as a mixed blessing. Perhaps that's more so in the West than it is in India, as well as the environmental concerns, which I've talked about. Some people express concerns about the potential for worker alienation and the extent to which workers have taken their economic gains in the form of material things rather than increased leisure. Workers themselves tend not to share those concerns. A high proportion of workers are satisfied with their jobs, including with vacation time and flexibility of working hours. That's particularly true in the United States, I think. Economic progress has been accompanied by social changes that have improved the opportunities available to women and members of minority groups. The evidence presented suggests that social evolution has been largely benign and emancipative. However, it is a net result of progressive struggle and conservative resistance. Conservative resistance has played an important role in preventing some social changes that if they'd gone ahead to a greater extent, we might now regret. Eugenics is an example that comes to mind. Freedom of expression plays a crucial role in ensuring open competition between opposing groups seeking to persuade members of the public of the merit of their views. As I wrap up, in order to summarize the main themes of the book, I've asked myself, what is the main point that I would like readers to take away from each chapter? So I'll just give you that point summary now. From chapter 1, self-direction is of fundamental importance to human flourishing. 2, liberty provides the context in which individuals can flourish in different ways, in accordance with their own values, provided they do not interfere with the rights of others. 3, the development of ideas about liberty and the recognition of natural rights have not been orderly processes. It was not inevitable that our natural rights would be recognized as much as they are today, and there are no grounds for complacency that they will continue to be recognized in future. 4, progress is the growth of opportunities to have the basic goods of a flourishing human. These are opportunities to exercise wise and well-informed self-direction, to enjoy health and longevity, to have positive relationships with other people, to live in harmony with nature, and to have psychological well-being. Technological advances and productivity growth have been of central importance to the growth of those opportunities. 5. The Industrial Revolution had its origins in ideas and rhetoric supporting positive attitudes toward science, commerce, and innovation. Over the last 200 years, ongoing innovation has been supported by the positive attitude that people have generally had toward new technology. Talking here about the West, of course, in some United States, Australia, Canada, Britain, they have been willing to accept the possibility that it might that new technology might disrupt their lives because they have recognized the benefits that it brings. 6. Progress seems likely to be disrupted over coming decades as a consequence of declining rates of productivity growth. However, I see reasons for optimism about the continuation of progress over the longer term. Remember, I'm talking about improved opportunities for human flourishing. 7. At the individual level, our capacities for wise and well-informed self-direction are of central importance to our own flourishing. Self-direction poses a challenge for everyone, but no one else is as capable as you are, as an adult, of knowing your own values and aspirations. That makes it unlikely that any other person or agency can manage your interests as well as you can. 8. At each stage of life, the extent to which each of us flourish is the outcome of wise investment in personal development and alertness to opportunities to become a better person. As people actualize their potential, they tend to experience an increased incidence of transcending experiences, such as feeling flow when engaged in creative activities. 9. The evolving context of growing opportunities has enabled people to meet their material aspirations by exercising self-direction to a greater extent than has ever been possible in the past. However, it has also given more people the opportunity to exercise self-direction to contemplate what their human nature requires of them if they are to flourish more fully. Before I finish, I should try to explain that last point more fully. What I am suggesting is that our human nature may require us to think beyond the utilitarian framework in which we judge what is good or bad for us wholly in terms of pleasure and pain. Perhaps it is in our nature to bring wonder into our lives by seeking to understand the essence of truth, beauty, and goodness. If so, we may take pleasure in doing that, whilst rejecting the idea that it is appropriate to employ the metrics of pleasure and pain to assess the worth of our endeavors. Thank you for your attention.
Winton Bates. It was really a very deep presentation, and you beautifully summarized, articulated, and it is a kind of deliberation which invites a lot of queries and questions, because you touched psychological perspective, economic perspective, and philosophical perspective also. So I request respected participant to raise his or her hand and ask his or her question. So I can see one raised hand. Yes, Engineer Ghanshyam ji. Yes, please.
Yeah.
Ask your question.
you have told about Maslow hierarchy and the self-actualization, how the self-actualization brings the growth in the human by increasing the potential, actualizing the potential, self-potential.
Sorry, I missed the question.
In Maslow hierarchy, you have told self-actualization.
Yes.
How the self-actualization will bring the potential growth in the human being.
Okay, self-actualization is actualization of potential. So we are all of us born with potential, and self-actualization is how well we play the hands we are dealt with. You're playing cards, you give the dealt these cards. How well you play those is about achieving your potential. Now, okay, so the first aspect, the deficiency goals aspect of it, so I talked about deficiency goals and transcending goals, and there's an author, Scott Barry Kaufman, who has written a book called Transcend, which is in the which tries to, I suppose, build on, update the Maslow's hypothesis. So Kaufman talks about these two things that you need to, that you need to survive, and you need your meet all these deficiency needs, these physiological needs and self-esteem needs and friendship and these very basic things. But then we need to be able to transcend that. A fully flourishing person is someone who is moving beyond those deficiency needs and using the higher needs, meeting the higher needs for love, being a noble person, I suppose, and being able to spend time meditating on what's really important in life. I'm not sure if that answers the question.
Thank you. We have second question by Professor Chattakulam. He's asking, can you make any correlation between achieve flourishing of humans and degrowth?
Missed the last part of it. A correlation between
achieve flourishing of humans and degrowth.
I'm still not catching it completely. Economic growth?
No, degrowth means the philosophy of degrowth, because we have a kind of a, you see, question. If we follow this kind of a growth pattern based on GDP and based on the growth, how can we achieve the flourishing human in that sense? So one has to address the issue of degrowth. Then we can think about your main thesis of achieving human. This is what there. Can you correlate any kind of relationship between the philosophy of degrowth and the achieving the human?
Yeah, okay. So I think as people's incomes rise, they become more concerned about things like the environment, and so they can afford to be, and for the most part they do. So in Australia we were a society that we would dig things up and cut things down without thinking about it too much. 50 years ago. Nowadays, it's become, because an increasing proportion of the population feel wealthy enough now that we should look after the environment and maybe make sure. It extends to things like encouraging people to take more leisure, workplace safety, workplace concerns, more equal opportunity at work. These kinds of things come to the fore because I think people can afford to look after them. So there is this relationship there. It's not something that happens inevitably, but it is something that does tend to happen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Fine. Thank you. Very interesting answer. Thank you. Fine. Okay. Excited.
I request Professor Gyan to also share some of his reflection, although he has already put the question. Yes, Dr. Gyan Lubi.
Thank you very much. I hope I am audible because I have some problem. Well, I will try to speak so with the headphones. Excuse me. Well, it was really very, very, very interesting, brilliant. I thank you very much. I posted some reflections of Mabubulak because I think that well, I think I have seen some similarities between the thought, for instance, of Mabubulak, the late Mabubulak, and Amartya Sen and your thought, especially as regards the correlation between human flourishing and freedom. Both Mabubulak and Amartya Sen always insisted in the past, Mabubulak, of course, that there is a correlation, that the freedom should be put into the concept of development, for instance, that is, that we cannot have a discourse, a really founded discourse and interpretation of development without putting freedom as one of the component, as essential component of development. I think that this point has remembered very many observations that you as brilliantly exposed about the correlation between freedom and flourishing. Well, what I would like to ask is in this direction, that is, but in a certain sense, you have already answered during your exposition. This flourishing is always connected to freedom, in spite of the fact that this perhaps is not the main assumption which dominate the economical world now, because I think that after a period in which we have seen the strengthening of some concepts, a human development index, for instance, now we are back to a conception of GNP as the only measure of development of a country, without considering the level of education, for instance, of freedom, of development of lives, of bettering of the health conditions, and so on and so forth. This, without this component, there is no really founded human flourishing. But I think that I have at least this impression that in a great part of the economical world, at least in Western Europe, and perhaps in the USA, I would say, the tendency now is more back to let's grow GNP and the rest will follow. That is, take care of GNP, as Mabubulak says, we have made so in the 70s, in the 60s, take care of GNP and poverty will take care of itself. And he said many times in his books, now this mentality was completely wrong. We have to attack poverty and we have not to wait that the growth in GNP will automatically better poverty. That is, it is not automatical growth in GNP and diminution of poverty. No, this is the wrong strategy. The flourishing is of humans, economic flourishing, mental flourishing, educational flourishing is something apart from GNP. GNP as a condition which is necessary but not sufficient to produce better life conditions. And he said very, very many times, the true, the authentic end goal, objective of development is to ensure that people have realized lives. That is, it is not only a question of GNP. And so my question is more or less, my notes is this, but I thank you very much for your brilliant exposition, and thank you very much. I could learn very, very many things. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for those comments. I should mention that I have great respect for Professor Sen and his works. Of course, at the outset of my book, I seek to distinguish myself from his approach, which tends to conflate freedom and development. And I think I felt that in order to make a contribution, I needed to take them apart and to talk about the determinants of freedom and the determinants of flourishing and how they interact together separately. So that's one part of it. You're a bit pessimistic, I think, about the focus of measuring social progress. I think, well, I don't think we've gone back to GDP. Certainly not in Australia. We have a federal treasurer who is saying, well, he has his own reasons for saying it, but I think he's trying to tell us that he wants us to measure things, his performance, not against GDP, but against other things. So I think, well, this country, but of course, Western Europe has its problems with energy and so forth. There's also there is still a strong environmental push, CO2 push to reduce CO2 emissions, and so that's part of the concern. Alleviating poverty, yeah, okay. I think the targets are set by the United Nations and so forth. The first round, I thought, were very good, but if you look at what's actually happened in China and India, I hope I'm on safe ground here, but I think the economic growth has lifted people up. All I guess there are social programs and so forth that helped, but you've got to have before you can distribute stuff, you've got to have it. You can't distribute what you don't have. So you've got to keep that production going in order to lift up the people at the bottom. Beyond the immediate
Thank you.
effect. So thank you very much for that comment.
Yes. We have a respected friend from Chennai, from Gandhi Peace Foundation, Chennai. His name is MD Chandar, and he's asking that humans are trapped in the name of war today at many corners around the world. How they can progress and flourish if no freedom for them?
How we can progress, how people can progress and flourish if they don't have freedom. That's the question. Yes, very difficult. I think it's important to make a point about inner freedom here. That Viktor Frankl talked about how even in a concentration camp, the one thing that they couldn't take away, the guards couldn't take away from you, was your inner freedom, that your own self-respect. They couldn't. They tried they could try. They did try, but that was that one thing, the inner freedom, that you couldn't take away from you. And I think in the ancient, the people who talked about the Stoics talked about inner freedom in the ancient world, and Epictetus, I think, was a slave. That he was able to say, well, there are some things we can change. There are some things we can do something about, and there are some things we can't. So there's external factors that you can't do anything about. Just have you accept them and focus on the things that you can do something about. There's a lot of wisdom in that. I think they went too far to say external factors aren't of any importance at all. But it's yeah. So, and of course, in that comes into modern psychology too. That thought of focus on the things that you can do something about, and being grateful for what you have seems to be helpful.
MD Chandar is with us now. I request, sir, would you like to add some of your input or points?
I'm sorry. Am I being asked if I'd like to add something further?
Asking to MD Chandarji from Gandhi Peace Foundation, Chennai, if he would like to add some points.
Okay. Thank you.
Maybe he is taking some time. So I request Niti Parjanji to ask her question.
Hello, am I audible? I have put it already in the chat box, but still thank you for giving me the chance. I would say the same thing. Thank you, sir. It was very nice presentation. We learned a lot of things. But as we all know, the climate crisis is the biggest concern of the planet today. So instead of we coming together, the people are all drifting away. In this scenario, how the flourishing of humans can happen? This current scenario of climate crisis. Thank you.
Okay, fine. I don't deny that climate change is happening. I think it's the costs of climate change are rising, but there are lots of other concerns with humanity, so that we shouldn't stop. Shouldn't prevent our. We shouldn't allow our concerns about climate change.
Respondents 2 to 18. Taking impact.
I'm sorry. I didn't catch that.
Yes, please go ahead.
Are we right?
No, it was not addressed to you. Please go ahead. Continue your conversation.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think that climate change should be taken seriously, but it should be seen in the context of the other things that we should be concerned about. So there is well, the increase in food prices, for example, last year was a huge issue for people in Africa. Anyway. There are increases in energy prices, concerns. There are, so our concern for climate change shouldn't prevent us from Australia, which I know something about. There's a move here to stop us from exporting gas, stop us from exporting natural gas. Now, I don't think that's a terribly good idea from the world's point of view, because there are, natural gas is a transitional thing from coal to renewable resources. So I think we've got to be a bit careful that we don't put say everything is about climate change, because there's lots of other things that we should be trying to pursue as well. And I'm particularly concerned about this decline in productivity growth, the decline in the rate of productivity growth in the high income countries. And that's going to mean that they're going to have a lower growth in government revenue, but the demands that are being made on governments are increasing. So it doesn't look good. I think we've got crises ahead, economic crises ahead. Not sure if that answered the question as well as I could have. But,
Thank you, Winton. It was really very enriching session. And I request respected chair of today's session to. Good.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I've enjoyed the presentation of my own opportunity to present and to hear the comments. I didn't get the comment, but none of this is relevant to us. So I feel, I'm my opening remarks about values being universal does apply, even though my focus has been on what I learned from the philosophers of ancient Greece and so on. I think what I said might have had some relevance. Well, from the questions and comments, it certainly did. And of course, you mentioned people like Sen, and of course, Gandhi. The whole world has to respect Gandhi. So I think that's probably a good point for me to end on.
Friends, we are very thankful to the professor because he gave us a synoptic view of a major global discourse about the idea of freedom together with progress in the context of potential for human flourishing. As he said towards the end of his presentation, that he is an optimist, and his optimism is rooted in the realities called scientific revolution, political revolution, and industrialization. He is also aware of the risks which are growing around us in an age of freedom and progress. And these risks, as he underlined, are about climate crisis, declining productivity, and towards the end, he also talked about the problem of togetherness of all of us on this planet. There are 4 E's: 2 relate with individual situation and 2 relate with macro realities. Individually, we are confronted with the problem of education and employment. The kind of resources which are available for getting educated, that is to be better informed, to be more enlightened, is becoming very unequal. There are commercializations wave of education, and this is being recognized by many philosophers and economists, what to do with creating a level playing field for all of us to get educated and better informed and more capable. The other one has to do with employment. Receding employability with new technology, artificial intelligence, computerization, many others are on the one hand reducing drudgery of life, on the other hand minimizing chances of gainful employment. So people are talking about redistributive systems, including increasing purchasing power of all the masses so that markets can be sustained. Collectively, there is a crisis of diminishing resources of energy. We are knowing that energy is a big need, and we are waiting for better technological and scientific revolutions to fulfill the gap being caused of diminishing fossil fuels, diesel, petrol, coal, etc. And the other one is, of course, apart from energy, environment. It is becoming a result of our collective style of life where nobody is willing to readjust, reduce the requirements of our life for our happiness, material requests. But I'm very happy that this professor has not led us into a jungle of ideas, because towards the end of his talk, he started with 5 conditions and he ended with 10 conclusions. So it's a very inviting opportunity for us. He has given us a framework of nearly 5 centuries of thought, from 16th and 17th century, 21st century. It was not an easy job. I thank you, Professor, for being so friendly in opening our minds. Otherwise, we give up. We don't know how to handle our collective challenges. So we regress into our own individual life situations. And we said, let the world take care of itself. I'm responsible for myself, and I don't want to bother about what happens to others because of my choices. I am very happy that you use the platform of Gandhi School of Democracy and Socialism. Gandhi would have been very happy to continue the conversation. So we hope that we'll get another opportunity of inviting you after digesting some of your ideas and becoming more capable of engaging in meaningful conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Winton, and all friends who joined today's, and it was really enriching session. So on behalf of
GSDS forum,
Professor delivered very excellent, insightful insight, I would say. And I also